So I'm going to focus on some lessons learned from non-extractive participatory research around agroecology and territorial food system transformation. That's the topic I was asked to address. So maybe I could have the next slide. And first and foremost, I'd like to introduce my co-researchers. These are my partners. They're not academic. They're farmers. They're indigenous people from the Bolivian and Peruvian Andes, women collectives in South India, Indonesian farmers, French, Italian farmers, pastoralists, as well as family farmers from West Africa. These are the people and groups with whom I've worked for many years, and much of what I'm going to share has come out of the interactions with these different actors. We've learned from each other, and in many cases, they've been my teachers and have helped me rethink what I learned at university. Could I have the next one, please? So I'm basing these reflections on long-term participatory research in these different places and with different communities. So the time span is quite long. These have been ongoing relationships, close to 30 years in India with women Dalit farmers, 9 years in Mali, and others 20 years. So these are long-term relationships. And the reflections I'm sharing are not so much theoretical reflections. I really want to help these reflections inform practice. I'm going to focus on 10 mutually supportive practices for much more power-equalising research and co-creation of knowledge. I use the word power-equalising research as synonymous with non-extractive participatory research. And what I'm really interested in this presentation is to share some thoughts on some enablers and safeguards for non-extractive ways of knowing. And this is a set of principles to be adapted rather than a blueprint. Next, please. But as soon as we talk about participation, it's very important to define where you stand on the participation spectrum. So I want to be clear about my position or positionality on participation. And I'm borrowing this quote from Dominique Méda, who's a French philosopher. And this is a vision of participation that emphasizes allowing each potential citizen subject within society to become real subjects by offering them a genuine autonomy to exercise their ability to give themselves laws and construct rule with others. And that more specifically implies giving individuals the means to participate in the daily construction of the rules of living together and to rethink political, social, and economic relationships in order to civilize them at a deep level. And that's done through the permanent exercise of the freedom to participate. Now, that vision of participation, that definition of participation has been implicit or explicit all over the years I've interacted with these communities. So it's at the liberatory, emancipatory end of various typologies of participation that we know about, such as Arnstein's ladder of participation or a typology proposed by Jules Pretty some time ago. Could I have the next one, please? Now, I think the first safeguard is really emphasizing that non-extractive research values people's knowledge and agency. And I think it'll become clear when I read two quotes from partners who've been involved in my own journey. This is from a farmer leader in Mali, who says that many urban-based intellectuals are ashamed of their rural and peasant origins and prefer not to mention them. Many researchers and decision makers also believe that small-scale family farmers, and women in particular, are backwards and ignorant, and that these farmers and food processors are a relic of the past that should be dispensed with as fast as possible. Similarly, in Peru, a partner over there says that, and gives many examples of the enduring racist and prejudiced attitudes which indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems experience when discussing issues of biodiversity, food and culture with so-called educated decision makers and scientists of Spanish descent. And the point I want to make here is that disempowering mindsets, attitudes, and behaviors really undermine people's knowledge and capacity for co-inquiry. And it's very important, if one is committed to non-extractive research, to cultivate, to nurture this idea of empathy, respect, and solidarity with other fellow human beings. And these are really important prerequisites for non-extractive participatory research. Without these enabling values, really enduring prejudiced views can continue to undermine the possibility of seeing ordinary people as knowledgeable actors. And people engaged in co-inquiry are knowledgeable and active actors, and they have the ability to produce and validate knowledge. Can I have the next slide, please? Just look at this and think of farmers, pastoralists, indigenous peoples, what they do. They're producers, they're makers, they're inventors, they're generators, breeders, creative workers. They can be artists, builders, architects of landscapes, but also houses, engineers, artisans and experimenters, all to various degrees, of course. I don't want to idealize things, but these aspect of creativity and the intellectual genius of rural people are at work in many communities across the globe, and it's important that we remind ourselves that this is the case. Next, please. So, the following safeguard, which I think is important, is the whole process of negotiated agreements on ways of working with local actors. And this requires lots of space and time for the free and prior informed consent of communities to do work with outsiders. Often it requires also the development of clear agreements on the terms of engagement, and that can take the form of mutually agreed code of research ethics. I've used one, which I'm happy to talk about afterwards. It's the Code of Ethics of the International Society of Ethnobiology. And relaxed long dialogues about the what and how of participatory research. And this whole prelude to doing any kind of work is very important. The agreements on ways of working, including on documentation. So in India, with Dalit women farmers in Andhra Pradesh, there was a fairly long process, about 3 months, where there were consultations in the villages led by the women farmers themselves. See, well, do we want to work with this guy or not? Do we want to do this? Eventually, they said yes. We do think this is important work around sustaining local food systems and re-territorialization of food systems. But they also came up with ideas I had never thought of. The idea that the documentation should not solely be done in a written form, as a classical researcher would do, but they asked to do the documentation as well using their community radio and local video making skills. They had been trained by the host NGO, the Deccan Development Society, to use video, make their films, and run a local radio station. And that turned out to be, something completely unexpected, which led to a remarkable outcome. Much of the process and the findings of the research, which went on as an action research program for about 12 years, were presented in the form of videos in this book called Affirming Life and Diversity. Can I have the next one, please? Now, equally important as a safeguard is to facilitate the creation of safe spaces for non-extractive participatory research. And here I mean facilitating spaces and arenas within which people feel comfortable enough, safe enough to gain the confidence to use their voice, to frame alternatives, to come together, to disagree, to agree, to build arguments and alliances, and mobilize and act. This is tremendously important, this notion of safe spaces for communication and action. Can I have the next one, please? And with this formation of safe spaces, there's a reversal from the normal. It's all about putting the perceptions, the priorities, the judgment, and the knowledges of farmers and food processors center stage. And when it comes to analysis and even quantifying, there's a reversal in roles here, where you hand over the stick and facilitate processes whereby local farmers map, count, analyze, present. And as an outsider, we facilitate using various tools like participatory video, participatory learning and action, VIP methods, methods very much focused on visualization techniques. These really generate remarkable findings, I feel. If I could have the next one. Linked with this notion of safe space is the idea of language justice. It's important for people to be able to express their feelings, their knowledge, explore the world in their own language. That seems, well, it's not necessarily obvious, because very often we expect local communities with whom we work to speak the language of the colonizers with the help of a translator. But very, very important to find ways of implementing this idea of language justice. So here in the picture was the first farmer exchange that took place in South India, and this involved Quechua indigenous peoples from Peru, Iranian nomadic pastoralists, Indonesian farmers, and Indian farmers. This was quite daunting for me, because I'd never organized anything like this, and my big problem was, how are we going to communicate? And we thought about it and said, well, you know, we're going to communicate in all languages, which was 7 languages. How do we do that? Well, we just brought in simple technology. It was basically portable earphones, which had become available by that time. This took place in, you've got the date there, it's 19, anyway, you have the date on there. And it was possible to structure the sessions in such a way that each person could follow the discussions in his or her own language and contribute in a native tongue. It was a long meeting, it was 14 days, but that was the kind of workshop, interactive workshop, that we had decided to do as a slow process of learning from each other in a rural context. And it was extremely enabling, empowering for everyone. Farmers at the end were joking, this is the United Nations of the peasants, you know. It's but this idea of language justice is crucial, and it's good to think about how to use resources to make this possible. If I could have the next one. Now, a 6th safeguard is a commitment to working with and integrating different ways of knowing. The idea that the whole, and it's a transdisciplinary whole, is much more than the sum of the parts. Here you're in Mali, and a session parallel to the Nyeleni event that took place in 2006. And again, in the room were farmers from Indonesia, India, West Africa, pastoralists from Iran, as well as indigenous people from the Peruvian Andean region. And in that room, it was also very apparent that there were different ways of knowing, different ways of relating to the world. There was a, obviously a rational, more scientific one. You see the posters presented there on farmer field schools, but there was also a lot of experiential ways of knowing, intuitive ways of knowing, spiritual, emotional ways of knowing. And these ways of knowing are incredibly important, and they span intuition, reason, sense perception, imagination, emotion, memory, and they're a manifestation of cognitive diversity and collective intelligence. And I think it's important to try and find ways of working with this cognitive diversity and all these different ways of knowing in a respectful way. And it's something we have to learn to do. And I don't have any recipes here, but it's being mindful about the importance of this if we want to create safe spaces for non-extractive research. If I could go on to the next one. Now, cognitive justice is also a very important principle or safeguard here. And by this, I'm using a definition provided by Shiv Viswanathan, an Indian scholar. He talks about the constitutional right of different systems of knowledge to exist as part of a dialogue and debate. So there's a refusal to accept hierarchies of knowledge between science, Western knowledge, and vernacular local knowledge. But it also implies the continued existence of the ecologies that would let these forms of knowledge survive and thrive, not in a preservationist sense, but as active practices. You have pictures of farmers, indigenous people in Peru, and their view of cognitive justice is that not only should their knowledge be respected, but everything else that makes that knowledge possible. They refer to their entire knowledge system, which includes the landscape, the territories that renew biodiverse food systems, as well as the culture and livelihoods. And for them, this idea of cognitive justice encompasses their whole life world. Similarly, the frameworks they use to think about how they go about inquiring, finding things about the world is very much rooted in their cosmovision, based on these different ideas of interaction between different ailus, communities or realms. So the first one, Runwailu, refers to humans and domesticated crops and animals. The Salka Ailu refers to wild species and spaces. And the Oki Ailu represents the sacred, including mountains, sacred sites, customary laws, and ethics. And as you interact in a non-extractive research mode with communities such as the Quechua, respectful conversations bring you to embrace or try and understand more of that cosmovision. And it's disconcerting, it's destabilizing initially. It was for me, but gradually you understand, better some aspects of indigenous cosmovisions and why the thinking, the actions are framed in that way. To give you a very practical example, we set up learning groups to accompany the action research we were doing. And of course, being Western trained, I thought learning groups would only be made up of people, human beings. But very soon, community members said we must have the Apus included in the learning groups. I said, what are the Apus? They said they're the sacred mountains and the beings in the mountains. So I had to get, that was a shock for me, I admit it. But, a few years later, primarily including the Apus in the process and enabling those interactions with the Apus as culturally appropriate in that locale. Can I have the next one, please? Now, this is an important one. The idea that we should engage in forms of extended peer review. Extended peer communities co-validate knowledge. The idea that we need diverse gatekeepers of knowledge to decide on the validity and quality of work done. Not just the criteria of quality and validity used by social or natural scientists, but the way different actors, different ways of knowing and different knowledge holders would validate or say that an outcome was truthful and reflected all the understanding that had been generated through a non-extractive participatory research process. And this can be quite elaborate. So here in the picture you have down at the bottom is a citizen jury in South India, which is underway, and that citizen jury focused on the priorities and governance of agricultural research. It was part of a participatory action research dynamic, and everything in that process was co-validated by a group of peers, which didn't just include scientists. There was an oversight panel made up of policymakers, local farmers, and respectable people who could vouch for the credibility, the trustworthiness, the transparency of the process. But there were also other observers who could exercise oversight and monitor and evaluate in real time what was happening, and probably say at the end that this is a valid process, it's trustworthy, it's credible. And these extended peer review processes are very, very important when it comes to dealing with complex processes and outcomes. And the process of peer review is not end of the pipe, as is the case with a scientific paper that you send to reviewers. It's continuous. And this is important because in a context of great uncertainty, unpredictability, we really need forms of post-normal science as expressed by Ravets and Futowitz. The idea that one, these times are far from normal, uncertainty now rules political and environmental affairs. Two, normal puzzle solving science is now thoroughly inadequate as a method and a perspective for solving the great social environmental issues of our times. And extended peer communities of citizens, of people, can no longer be relegated to second-class status. And their special knowledge can no longer be dismissed as unscientific, inferior, or bogus. After all these actors have partial and incomplete knowledge, and the trick here is to bring together all these different partial and incomplete knowledge to generate forms of collective intelligence that can help us address very complex, messy problems we're faced with. But these extended peer communities are important safeguards for the generation of inclusive, valid, relevant, and high quality knowledge needed to adaptively respond to rapid changes and uncertainty, but also to carry out what we're calling here non-extractive participatory research. It really enables the emergence of transdisciplinary forms of collective intelligence. Can I have the next one, please? Now, I talked about participatory action research, so you'll recognize this classical cycle of, planning, action, reflection, and it's iterative, it goes on. with a commitment to open framing of questions and the involvement of participants in defining different stages in the research. Now, it's interesting that when these kinds of processes happen over a period of time and trust is built up among people engaged in non-extractive participatory research, that you actually see more and more of the local actors proposing or even deciding what should be the next step of the research. And that's fascinating. So this is what I'm showing here with this little squiggle. You have this line at the bottom showing that you have things that shoot off on the side in different directions in ways that you never expected. So I'll just give an example by going on the next slide. After completing a series of citizen juries on the governance of food and agricultural research, there was a lot of media coverage in West Africa. After the press and news died down a little bit, we all met. That was the steering committee and some of the farmers involved in these citizen juries, and we talked about what had been done and what we should be doing next. And the farmers were very clear. They said the next step is we've got to take our recommendations on food and agricultural research. We've got to take our recommendations and discuss them with AGRA, the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, which was perceived as a threat, and also the donors of AGRA. So the Gates Foundation, as well as big donors like UK Aid, and I think at the time Sweden was also supporting that. And they turned to me and said, Michel, that's what you've got to do. You've got to organize a series of policy dialogues with all these big people. And that was paralyzing for me. But as per our process, that was quite normal for them to say to a researcher, this is what you've got to do, turning the table around. So eventually, yes, after a long story, it did facilitate a year and a half later, I think, 2 years later, a high-level policy dialogue involving senior researchers and senior management from AGRA, a representative of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and farmers from West Africa who had been mandated by their peers to come along and present their recommendations and their vision for food and agricultural research in West Africa. The whole thing was chaired by the UN Special Rapporteur of the Right to Food and the president of Oxfam Novib. Can I have the next one? We also had a link with the UK Parliament because the UK, the government of my country, also provided a lot of money for AGRA. And how do you talk with people like that? So we innovated, and we managed to establish a video link between the University of Ghana, Accra, where the meeting was held, and the House of Lords, where various members of Parliament from the House of Commons and the House of Lords and DFID met. And we had lunchtime interactive sessions where both farmers as well as members of AGRA would report back, put arguments to people in London and vice versa. I didn't expect we were going to do anything like that, but that's where, non-extractive participatory action research can take you. You always have to be prepared for surprise and change direction if this is the wish of actors who are involved in that process of co-production, co-validation of knowledge. Can I have the next one, please? Now, the idea of non-extractive participatory research also contains this idea of rebalancing power. So a lot of my work and the work of some people online here, I see Chris is here and Colin is online, is about strengthening grassroots research and development systems for territorial food system transformation. And here, it's about consciously reinforcing, strengthening various processes that really define an alternative system of research. Research that's much more self-managed, much more grassroots, and it's also locally controlled. And some of the key defining elements here are dialogues of wisdoms and intercultural dialogues, peer-to-peer learning, horizontal learning, education that combines political with practical knowledge, and a whole process that tries to build local organizations and strengthen their networks. This is from a paper Chris, Colin, and I put out some time ago based on European examples, but it's valid for other parts of the world. Here, what I'm saying, though, is that the non-extractive and participatory research is mindful about building local skills, local capabilities, and local agency and collective agency to carry out better the kinds of knowledge production processes that happen in those places. Okay, the next one. So it's all about finding ways of deinstitutionalizing research for autonomous learning as part of a power equalizing process, with a strong emphasis on self-managed farmer-led research and citizen oversight. So this is where you connect with my understanding of participation, my positionality of participation as expressed in that quote from Dominique Meda at the beginning of my talk.